Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Remember, if you like what you hear, leave your rating or review on your chosen podcast platform. We thank you in advance as it helps new listeners discover and enjoy our show as much as we hope you are. In this episode, we are joined by Marsha Shandur, a storytelling, communication, and sales coach and trainer who founded Yes, Marsha, a company that has helped thousands of executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals gain storytelling skills for ethical influence. Diana and Marsha begin by emphasizing the significance of empathy in effective storytelling. Through well-crafted narratives, people can connect with and gain insights into experiences they may not have personally encountered. They conclude their discussion by stressing the importance of empathy and curiosity in communicating with someone who may have inaccurate information rather than solely focusing on proving oneself to be right. Now let's have a conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Soft Skills Salon podcast. I am still Diana Kowarski. This is your podcast where you learn how soft skills make a difference to your work, your teams, and your whole organization. Here we have conversations with international and diverse voices, both novices and experts, discussing and reflecting on their real life perspectives, strategies, and insights. At the Soft Skills Salon podcast, we say that conversation is the currency of communication. And so please join me. We are going to be having a conversation with Marsha Shandur of Yes, Marsha, who believes that storytelling skills are the key, not a key, but the key to ethical influence. A storytelling, communication, and sales coach and trainer, she has taught thousands of executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals across the world and has got rave reviews from clients like Royal Bank of Canada, HelloFresh, TJX Companies Incorporated, and Shopify. Before launching Yes, Marsha, she spent 15 years working as a radio DJ, where she gained a powerful understanding of how to tell stories in a way that fosters connection, trust, engagement, and loyalty. Her work has been featured in Forbes, the BBC, and Mashable. Hello, Marsha, and thank you so much for your time.
I'm so excited to be here.
We have some fantastic questions that Marsha has pre-selected from our Soft Skills Impact questionnaire. And we're going to begin with one that has been remarkably popular with our listeners, and I honestly believe it will continue to be so. And I'm curious to hear what Marsha has to say about it. That question is, where have you seen or experienced empathy in your career? What comes to mind, Marsha?
So I was thrilled to see this question in the list. I don't know if you know what is happening in our brains when we're listening to a well-told story. But they've done studies where they stick people in MRI machines and they look at their brains when they are listening to or telling a well-told story. And what happens is that your brain, so right now, if we were to look at your brain, the parts of your brain that would be lighting up are called Broca's area and Wernicke's area. They're the data processing parts. But if I was telling you a story, the parts of your brain that would be lighting up are the parts of your brain that would light up if my story was happening to you. So I talk about smelling coffee, your olfactory cortex lights up. I talk about grabbing a pen, your motor cortex lights up, specifically the part related to hand movement. And so I often talk about this in terms of connection because that's also happening to my brain and it's also happening to the brain of every single person in the room. You know, I feel like we've all felt that energy when someone's telling a story and everyone's listening, whether it's 5 people or 5,000 people. And I used to call it alchemy until I realized it was neurology. Everybody's brain's lighting up in the same place at the same time, like a giant benign alien invasion. But it's also incredibly powerful empathy. And I believe that storytelling is growing empathy because you haven't had every experience. But when I tell you a well-told story, your brain thinks that you are experiencing it. And I have discovered this, I've been doing this work for 10 years. And I've come across so many stories. So, for example, I'm a white, cis, non-disabled woman who straight people think is straight. And so I don't experience a lot of discrimination. Where I do, I'm a non-bio parent. And so I experience it there, but that's not something that's obvious from looking at me. I've certainly never experienced racial discrimination. But when I have worked with with people who are people of color, with clients of color on their stories around racial discrimination, I'm never going to fully understand what that's like, but I can touch it. They can describe it in a way where my brain thinks it's happening to me, and I'm connecting, whether it's through the emotions, whether it's through sensory detail. And so it's giving me this level of empathy that I wouldn't otherwise have. And I believe that lack of empathy is the root of all evil. And so I think just by telling stories and just by listening to stories, we're defeating evil. And that's powerful. So I see empathy every day in my work, in almost everything I do. And the other part of my work is, you'd mentioned ethical influence, which I'm now calling ethical persuasion. So it's sort of two, we do storytelling, but we also do ethical persuasion, which is how can you convince somebody to do a thing in a way that makes them feel better off just for you having asked them, irrespective of what they say. And that again, and I know we're going to talk about this maybe in a later question, but that again, all comes down to empathy, because when you go in broadcasting your needs, you're not empathizing, and that's actually not very effective. But when you can use some empathy, that is how you get things done. And that is how you get people to do things for you in a way where they feel good about it. And we can go into that more. I feel like I know we have a later question.
There's lots already that you offered. I appreciate that. So I often have thought about storytelling, not necessarily intricately in combination or in relationship to empathy. So I appreciate that perspective. And, when I'm teaching or coaching around storytelling, business storytelling in particular, it's usually much more simplified for me, in that what I would say is data alone is a half brain approach, and data within a story can be more of a whole brain approach. And the idea that we do have storytelling as a means, as you said, and I wrote this down, in appreciation of growing empathy. I guess my appreciation of your comments has led me to a question, because it does suggest that the integral component that we're not really talking about, that you did mention briefly, is the listening, right? The other side. So if we grow empathy through telling a story, and then if we are dependent in a way, or at least hopeful, if I'm remarkably reserved, of being listened to, it's the listening that is a requirement, not a luxury, in order to grow empathy. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I say well-told stories, because badly told stories, first of all, they don't grow empathy because they don't include the parts that won't, but also they're less likely to be listened to. And so I think if you want to be listened to, then tell better stories, which is like anyone can do. I know some people might, oh God, I'm not good at that. At the beginning of my workshops, I always say, this is a set of rules that anyone can follow. And we all know this. So I get everybody, I say, okay, raise your hand if you have that one person in your life who can tell any story and it's fascinating. Most of the room raises their hand or writes in the chat, yes. And then I say, okay, now raise your hand if you have been stuck next to that person who did something interesting, but oh my gosh, when are they going to stop talking because they're so boring I may fall asleep or die? And everybody raises their hand. And I say the first person is following the rules, the second person is not. And so anybody can be a good storyteller. But yeah, if you want people listening, the same with any kind of communication. If you want people to listen, you have to be good at it. And to be good at it, you have to work. And I think, to me, empathy is an essential part of being good at communication, because there are brilliant speakers out there who do not connect with me because they're not, if you're speaking on your love of the far right, or how you think it's terrible that people get to choose their pronouns based on their own gender image, then I'm not going to listen to you, because I think, you don't have any empathy for me, or I think, humanity in general. And so I think empathy is core to any effective communication.
Right. And you mentioned how we touch others' stories. And I thought that was an interesting turn of phrase, to touch others' stories, and the idea of there being some mental, tactile approach of there being a set of information, or there being a description of an experience, or even, an affiliation one might have with a concept, and the touching of that story for me might expand my own repertoire, or solidify one of my assumptions, or question and bias I have, overt or covert, or bore me. There's so many options. We actually listen, right?
And I feel like I see it. So I have my own storytelling show that I run. True Stories Told Live Toronto is my passion project. And then I run storytelling shows for organizations as well. And so sometimes it's getting staff members to come and tell stories. Sometimes it's getting former clients to come and tell a story about how that product or service or organization has changed their life. And we do it for sales teams and part of doing that is for the sales teams. I mean, really it works for everybody in the building, but specifically for sales teams, because the first sale you have to make is to yourself. And so if you can have someone come in and talk about their experience, I worked with a college recently, and there's a college and there's a university in the same town. And so people who go there tend to go to one or the other. And, the college are often seen as like the little sister, and we had former clients come in and talk about how, one guy who'd come from India, he'd never left his country before, and he turns up and he's so nervous, and then he's really welcomed by this small community, and him going through those experiences, it's like everybody in the audience knows what it feels like to be nervous, knows what it feels like to be, fish out of water, to be somewhere and think, oh gosh, everybody knows each other and nobody does. And everybody knows the like relief of being welcomed, of somebody being kind to you, of somebody stepping towards you when you feel so isolated. And then you can see in the audience, I remember that the very first time I did it for an organization, the lady who had hired me said the first story was being told. The first client is up there, and she could see some commotion in the audience, and she was thinking, I hired this very good storytelling coach. Why is there a commotion? And she realized it's because they were passing Kleenex around. And I was like, yes, tears are one of my metrics. And you're not going to cry if you're just like, that's an interesting set of facts. I'm really, you're going to cry because a story has moved you, and a story is going to move you because you have touched what it feels like to be in that experience.
And if you've touched that, to go back to empathy, perhaps those themes that you mentioned, right, whether we refer to them as themes or narratives or meta-narratives around, nervousness, or some of the cliched language like fish out of water, or transition of, either geography or opinion. Of course, at that narrative level, all of us, if we have some self-awareness around empathy, ideally can tag some of our own experiences, whether as grand as relocating from Asia to North America, or as small as moving from one side of the street to another. And so perhaps that's one of the major themes then, or a major link between the storytelling empathy approach.
Well, I would say the most important part of storytelling. So people often think the biggest mistake that people make in stories is too much detail, but it's not. It's not enough of the right detail. And the most important thing in any story is to answer the question, how did you feel? How did you feel? How did you feel? Because I have not had every experience, but I have had almost every emotion. And so, for example, I worked with a client, this amazing woman called Deborah Owens, who runs an organization called the Corporate Alley Cat, that is an organization that helps people of color working in corporate. And we worked on her story of experiencing racial discrimination. Uh-huh. And so there's a point in her story where her boss calls her, and it's the boss with whom all the problems began, but it was the very first point. He calls her and she picks up the phone, and they've just had a meeting together, and he says, Deborah, help me understand this. And in the tone of his voice, she knows what's coming. Right. And what she experienced was this drop in her chest and this feeling of dread, but also this feeling of, people told me this wasn't going to happen to me, but I knew it was going to happen to me, and now it's happening. Mm. And I feel like all of us have had that experience in some way of like hoping that the awful thing isn't going to happen to us, but then it happens. And it's like this feeling of inevitability, but also crushing disappointment.
Would you say that's dread in a way?
It's dread, but it's also the disappointment. I think it's also, and I think it happens for all of us in some respect, that mm-hmm. whether it's work, whether it's romance, whether it's this feeling of like, I don't want this. Like the first thing I thought of, which is, I don't love that this was my first thing that I thought of, but in my 20s, I had a lot of very unsuitable relationships because I hadn't had enough therapy to figure out that, I was seeking them out, because then I had, control over whatever it was. But I'd think, oh, maybe this one's going to be okay, and then I would be dumped or ghosted or whatever, and it was this feeling of like, it's so awful, and also I was expecting this, and somehow that makes it more awful. Or like, I worked with a storyteller recently. They told their story, and I made this relation to it. Have you seen the movie Frozen, Diane?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so my daughter hit Frozen about a year ago. I hadn't watched it up until then, and I've watched it, I don't know, probably 12 times, not out of choice. And I would watch it 15 more. I think it is an incredible movie. I find it so. I listen to the soundtrack and I start crying. So there's a bit in the movie where. At the risk of putting in a spoiler, but I think probably most people know the story. So Elsa, our Snow Queen, has, she's finally let everybody know that she can freeze things. She's gone up on the mountain. She's sung her big number, Let It Go, which is all about how, like, I'm finally free. I don't have to keep this secret anymore. I'm literally getting goosebumps. Can you see this? Just talking about it. So for the purposes of people listening on the video, Diana,
there are literal
goosebumps. And then her sister Anna comes up the mountain to say, "Oh, you've set off an eternal winter." And Elsa sings, and this makes me cry just saying it. She sings, "I'm such a fool, I can't be free." And I'm such a fool. I feel like it's a feeling all of us have had of, how could I think that this thing that everybody else gets is for me? And sometimes that's about career. Everybody else gets to do this thing in their career, but I'm inherently broken in some way, and I'm not going to. Everybody else gets a relationship that looks like this, but that's not going to happen for me. Everybody else gets a family that looks like this. And it's like, how I'm such a fool for thinking, I got my hopes up and now they've been dashed and I'm such a fool. And it's so relatable. And particularly, I feel like those feelings are exacerbated because social media makes it look like everybody has these perfect things that they maybe don't necessarily. Anyway, Absolutely. All of that to say, like, to me, that moment where Deborah picks up the phone and her manager says, help, can you explain this to me, Deborah? Help me understand this, Deborah, I'm such a fool, I can't be free. It's that incredibly relatable moment. And so again, I am a white woman who's lived in London, Edinburgh, and Toronto. I have never experienced racial discrimination. I'm almost certainly never going to, but I can get some sense of it through the emotion. And so if you have emotions in your stories, then people can relate. And it also shows us the stakes, it shows us whether or not to care. If you say, I crashed my car into my neighbor's fence, we might be like, okay. But if you say, I crashed my car into my neighbor's fence and I was terrified, I crashed my car into my neighbor's fence and I was delighted.
Right.
Suddenly we're like, why? So it shows us the stakes. It also draws us in. It creates tension. It creates an information gap because now we want to know why you're delighted. And what happens when you create that information gap is that my brain starts flooding with dopamine and oxytocin. So I'm happier and I trust you more. So it does so emotions are so powerful. But for me, the ways that they're the most powerful is how you create the empathy.
And so I enjoy all of that. And thank you for those stories and examples. The suggestion then that seems to, be the undercurrent perhaps, is that in order for emotions to be infused in stories, to be more impactful, if I'm understanding correctly, one needs to have some self-awareness around what emotions they experience.
Yes.
And self-awareness is a big piece that I'll say, with a broad brushstroke of generalization, has come up in many of our episodes in relationship to soft skills. And so I wonder about your thoughts around self-awareness in order to be able to have that sensory experience, but then also the vocabulary to articulate that one may indeed actually be feeling blank when some perhaps don't have that skill set.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's nothing in your life that self-awareness doesn't make better. I mean, I think I feel strongly that therapy should be free and available for everyone. And it's heartbreaking to me that it isn't accessible for a lot of people. Although I think people also don't realize that there are student therapists and that there are sliding scales and that there are ways you can get it. And even just on a base level, one of the things I teach in my storytelling workshop. So we talk about the different ways you can express emotion. One is internal monologue. One is describe physically where you feel it in your body. Like I said earlier about Deborah, how it dropped in her chest. But the middle one is just name the emotion. I was happy, I was sad, I was scared, I was angry. Yep. And what I suggest to people is that if that's something that they're not good at, and for a lot of British people and settler North Americans, we're not, that is my people's gift to your people, you are welcome. What you do is you just pick something that you do several times a day and ask yourself, how do I feel? So what, if it's getting a glass of water or going to the washroom, and you may remember 1 in every 10 of those times, but that's still something. And you probably won't feel much of anything, because when we have strong feelings, we tend to go offline and not remember things like that question Marsha asked us to remember. But you ask yourself, how did I feel? You might be like, I'm a tiny bit happy. I'm a little bit annoyed. And I have a client who, she's wonderful. She's very expressive. She's a retired dancer. And we came back in our second meeting. She said, Marsha, you told me to observe how I feel whenever I use the washroom. And my emotion is always joy, because I love urinating, which is like fully something I can get behind.
And it is worth noting that in that laughter, even you're sharing vicariously your client's experience, I can connect to that. I'm sure that the listeners can connect to that. There's moments when we do have relief and or joy and or a whole slew of other possible emotional connections to a successful completion of a bodily function, that we often don't articulate particularly well. So that's a big deal. And I would echo your comments that, self-awareness is one of those ideas. And I think your connection with the internal landscape to an external behavior, hopefully can be a mechanism or an exercise for folks or anyone who is trying to practice, is trying to practice more of the articulation for themselves within their self-talk, but certainly, trying to develop the interpersonal awareness of what the vocabulary is that represents what's going on. And there's a lot going on, of course. Let's continue. And I'm delighted with all of the great information that you're sharing. So thank you again, Marsha, for being here. We're going to go to another question now that I'm really curious about. And you chose this question. It's item number 10, and it reads, how do you have a conversation with someone who has their facts wrong? And there is so much riddled into this question in terms of perhaps a moral stance. There's some assumptions in there. It's talking about how versus what. And I'm so pleased that you chose this one, because I think there's a lot we can get into. What are your thoughts?
So I think this is where empathy comes in. And this is where empathy and curiosity. And this is like such a deep part of the ethical persuasion workshops that I teach, and the work that I do with people one-on-one on this was originally born out of helping people write sales pages. Because what we tend to do when we want to do something is we tend to go in and broadcast what we want and what we know to be true. But actually that's not very effective. So what we need to do is think about, what does the person we're speaking to know to be true and want? And how can we reverse engineer that back to us? And I think what's happening when somebody has their facts wrong is what they know to be true is different. They don't think, oh, here's a bunch of facts, they're probably wrong, but I'm just going to cling to them anyway. They believe, as far as they're concerned, those facts are correct.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so I think the very, very, very first thing you have to do, actually, before anything else, okay, so you're a teacher. You teach things.
I teach. I'm not a teacher, but
I'm not a teacher. But I just mean you are a person who teaches. Yeah. Not in the sort of little kid job sense. If you had to pick between teacher, nurse, plumber, you'd probably pick teacher.
I don't actually. I haven't.
Maybe all three.
I like the idea of knowing about plumbing, but that's a different conversation.
Oh no. I mean in terms of describing what you do to someone who's 5. So you are a person who teaches, and so you understand. Well, I'm running these workshops, and I run these workshops, and sometimes they're 90 minutes, and sometimes they're 3 days. And I want people to leave with all of these things. But really, when you're teaching, when you're doing a talk, a keynote or a workshop, you mostly want people to leave with one sentence, right? At the core, if nothing else.
Indeed.
And so when I'm running an ethical persuasion workshop, the one sentence I want them to leave with is, before you go into an interaction where you want to persuade someone, whether that's a conversation, whether that's writing some copy, whether that's putting together a presentation, take a minute to sit and think about who you're talking to and what's going on for them. So it's so much more than that. And in the workshop, it's very practical and it's very nuanced. But that's the thing. So there's a story I tell at the beginning of my workshops about a year ago, standing in my bathroom, breathing deeply while my daughter's going, no, I don't want to do it. She was 3. And I say, come on, we've got to brush your teeth, and it's getting late. And she said, no, brushing teeth is boring. And I'm about to give up, when I suddenly see the hand soap, in one of those pumps.
Yes.
And I pick it up and I wave it at her and I say, "Oh, what are you doing?" And she like looks at the hand soap, looks at me, looks back at the hand soap and goes, "Brushing my teeth." And I'm like, "Well, which one are your teeth? How do you do that?" And she points at her teeth and she gets the toothbrush and goes on to perfectly brush her teeth. So she's 3. Mm-hmm. What I did when I went in there was I went in there with my interests. Number 1, dental health is important. Number 2, as I told her, it's getting late. She's 3. She doesn't care. She's not going to go. She calls me Maymay. She's not going to go, "I'm sorry, Maymay. I know there's a new episode of This Is Us you have not caught up with yet. I will hurry up and brush my teeth." Like, she doesn't care. But what does she care about? Her problem is that brushing teeth is boring. Her desired outcome, she loves to educate inanimate objects. It is a big passion of hers. So when I addressed her problem, when I spoke to her desired outcome, when I led her towards it, she very willingly did exactly the thing that I wanted her to do. And so in the same way, if you're speaking to people who have their facts wrong, you can't just go in and say, "You've got this wrong," because then you're just yelling at each other through your megaphones. And it's like having an argument on Facebook. It doesn't work. But if you can go in, figure out where they are, figure out what are their interests. And by the way, it is the same. If you're trying to get your 3-year-old to brush her teeth, if you're trying to get the CEO to take on a new project that you want them to, if you're trying to get your staff to be on board with this change that is going to involve them either getting a pay cut or some people, being fired, whatever it is, the rules are the same. The rules are, what do they know? What do they think they know, even if you know it's not true? What do they want, or what do they think they want, even if you know that that's not really what they want? What problem do they think they have? And what are the words and phrases they're using to describe it? And you can do some of this work before you even speak with them. I work with clients on keynotes sometimes. So when we're building a keynote, we spend the whole of the first session just doing a deep dive into like, who are they? What do they care about? I have sometimes an exercise I do where we find a place for the client to relate to the people they're speaking to. And we basically climb inside their memories and look around and say, okay, what were your internal monologues at that point? What was going on for you at that point? Because the more specific you can be in your empathetic communication, the more likely they are to buy into whatever it is you have to say. And so it means first of all, doing that work yourself and then doing that work with them, bringing curiosity to a conversation. My favorite book in the whole world, my favorite nonfiction book, which I make myself read once a year, is Difficult Conversations by Stone, Patton and Heen. Comes out of the Harvard Negotiation Project. And it's just brilliant. And I think what often happens with difficult conversations is people think, well, why should I have to bend over backwards because they're the one being unreasonable? And what I loved about that book and what I've learned in my work is that it's not about bending over backwards. It's about asking yourself, what is the quickest route to getting what I want? In that interaction with my daughter, I was right. Dental health is important and it is getting late, but that doesn't matter to her. So the quickest route to getting what I wanted was to bring the hand soap to life and then ask her to teach it how she brushes her teeth. And so I got what I wanted. There was no resistance. It happened so much quicker than it would have done if I had forced the issue. And believe me, I have tried that in the past. It was not fun for anyone. It meant that we didn't then have a major meltdown before she went to bed because she'd suddenly been forced to brush her teeth. And she had a good time in the process. Like we both had a good time, actually. I
find a lot of value in what you've brought forward, and the idea of ethical persuasion in working with someone who may have their facts wrong. You really bring forward a lot of what I've seen over decades around the significance of audience analysis or listener analysis, and taking that even a little bit further. The question that you posed closer to the end of all that great information that you shared was, what is the quickest route or route? And for me, in my wee little brain, that translates into purpose and clarity of purpose. And oftentimes, especially if there is the potential for discord, which can result if there are facts that are understood differently. And I'm a big proponent of, there being facts that can be fluid. And your facts might not be my facts, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have a clear, impenetrable right, wrong. And my core, I I sort of rebel against that, but perhaps that's another conversation. So the purpose of a conversation, whether it is a negotiation with members of our household or with our, family or community, or if it is in our work arenas, the purpose, I'd say to you, quite rarely is to prove that I'm right and that you are less than me and that this is, forever and ever. The purpose is almost always a variation of how do we move this forward?
And yet in the moment, it's so hard to do. Part of the reason I reread that book once a year is because I'm very good at doing this with people I don't know. But I think the closer you get to the core of your family, it's like, I remember a few years ago being on a plane and someone had been kind of rude to me. And then I saw that she was just really stressed. And I had this big realization of, everybody is just trying their hardest to be happy. They're just trying their hardest. Yes. And I remember not long afterwards thinking, everybody is just trying their hardest to be happy, except for my partner. She's trying to mess with me. That's how it feels. It's so hard to remember that.
I agree with you. And I think travel, especially from my own experience with some horrendous stories around luggage and delays in the last couple of months, I had a similar experience where I had gotten quite entrenched in some of what I thought to be my own clients having some difficulties and found myself trying to figure out how to get things moving forward. And I was agitated sitting there, and the flight I was waiting for was delayed. And there was a young mother who had 3 young children with her, 2 of whom would not cooperate whatsoever, and we're at a volume that I've heard very rarely come out of, especially such small little bodies.
It's amazing, isn't it?
My first, in that moment, and I'm not proud of it, although I have used it and I'm proud of my reflection on it, my first inclination was one of judgment. And someone who has and is now actively parenting as well, I looked over at this woman and I had thoughts about her skills and what she was doing. And it took me a couple of minutes because I really wanted them to be quiet, Marsha. I really did. If only so I could wallow in the volume of my own thoughts, which in hindsight wouldn't have done me any good anyhow. However, it took me a couple of minutes and a few more sips of my tea. It was an early flight. And I realized, my goodness, this is a very young person. Those are very little children. There are a lot of them.
She's outnumbered.
She was outnumbered. I can't imagine being this person. And she's clearly trying to do something. And I have no idea what the backstory is or what the circumstances are or whether the kids are hungry or happy or sneezy or dopey or whatever's going on. And I was so taken aback by how long it took me to get there that I've told that little reflection actually a couple times over in the last few months, because I got there, but I had to take a longer route.
And that was with someone with whom there was zero stakes,
right.
With whom you had zero relationship. And so it's so hard to do. And it's so valuable when you do, even as we're talking, I find I talk about this stuff and there's a tiny bit of my brain being like, what about this conversation you're about to have? And what about that one? And I'm like, because I plan to go in there being like, I'm going to show them how right I am, but I think you're so right that it's purpose. And that's actually, when I talk about ethical persuasion, when I run the workshops, I say there are 3 points to it. And one is, what do I want and know to be true? 2 is, what do they think they want and think they know to be true?
Yep.
And then number 3 is, how do we reverse from number 2 back to number 1? But actually what's important in there is, what do you want? And that you have to be clear on that. And I think that's just generally in business a mistake that people often make, that they think, I've got to write a homepage. And it's like, no, why are you writing a homepage? What do you want people to do differently as a result? I've got to write a keynote. Okay, what do you want people to do differently as a result? When I work with clients on keynotes, I always ask them, what are your goals? And I realized I had to break it down because everybody wants to be a good person. So I have to ask them, what are your goals in terms of good in the world? Honestly, I'm mostly asking them just so that they can feel good about themselves. And then I say, and now what are your goals in terms of bringing money or glory to you? Right. And we ask that because that's going to influence how we shape the talk. You know, whenever I'm writing keynotes for people, I never have them sell from the stage, but we write the talk in a way where we're dropping tiny little commercials for whatever it is they want that do not look like commercials, that are fully supporting a point that they make. And Absolutely. So, but you have to answer that question, what do I want in any conversation, whether you're speaking to somebody whose facts are wrong, whether you're trying to, have a sales conversation, what is your immediate, and I think particularly when it's something like sales conversations or actually any conversation, it's like, what is the next step I need this person to take? Like what I really want is for my daughter to want to brush her teeth every single night, to do it quickly and to understand the importance of dental health. But in that moment, I just needed her to brush her teeth then.
Exactly. And what I want to do right now is to thank you very much for your time and on behalf of the listeners as well for joining us on this episode. And ultimately, I would want to continue knowing you and perhaps we'll find a way of working together at some point. So thank you very much, Marsha.
This was so fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to another dynamic and informative episode of the Soft Skills Salon with your host, Diana Kowarski. Please consider subscribing to our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. And we also encourage you to visit our website and social media links, which you can find in the show's notes. We look forward to bringing you another episode. And remember, conversation is the currency of communication. Bye for now.